John, it's time to kick out the jams.
Kick out the jams, motherfucker. So we haven't been using that E very often,
Well,
very
they
much
didn't they didn't
explicit next
say
to
that
us.
in the
Yeah,
Spotify thing. I was
I
waiting
know.
for that.
I know. It's they did in the album I had growing up listening to it, but I'm going to kind of give a quick bio of the MC5 because one of the things I found quickly as I was doing my research is you start to see the same stories and through line with the MC5 over and over again. So you're sort of reading the same stories and the same ideas. And it really does give you an essence of who the MC5 were. But at its most basic, I didn't say basic, I said its most basic, right? So at its
You're
most
good.
basic, the MC5's modern reputation is almost as a band that was ahead of their time in nearly every way, right? That's how they're always thought of these days. They're a foundational group in terms of what would eventually become punk music. They're in many ways a foundational group of what would become noise rock because of the feedback. They are a highly political, left-wing political group that would predate punk groups like the Dead Kennedys, and they don't sound quite like Rage Against the Machine, but they sort of share that primal energy that Rage Against the Machine had, as well as strong left wing politics. So the MC5 in many ways are as much about the ethos of who they were as they were a group themselves. Now that's not to say that they didn't make great music, but they also weren't around very long. They were around from about 1967 as a live act to about 1972-ish. Only released 3 albums, of which this one, Kick Out the Jams, was their first and was a live album. And in sort of a way that would presage punk a little bit. Their take was most bands release a couple albums, then do a live album. So we're going to do the live album first, and then we'll release some studio albums because it's fitting with their ethos. So I normally don't run down the lineup of the group, but there were a couple different ones. The two most well known members of the MC5 are Wayne Kramer and Fred Sonic Smith, and they're the guitarists. Fred Sonic Smith, I think, is probably as well known for marrying Patti Smith as he is for being in the MC5. He kind of had a second life afterwards. He died young. Multiple members of this band died young, and
That's
some
not
of that is
surprising.
because they lived hard, real hard.
They lived like they
But
played.
they did. Yeah, Wayne Kramer was on most of the '70s and a fair amount of the early '80s. He was spending trying to kick a variety of drugs, but it was fitting in terms of sort of their almost, I don't want to say anarchist because they had strong beliefs, but they were very much of a time in left-wing political culture that you hear talked about a lot. And they weren't just in the left wing like Woodstock left wing. We're talking about eventual Weather Underground type left wing, right? Ahead of that time. So and they were members of they were the house band most famously for the White Panthers, which was the white allies of the Black Panthers. In fact, their manager slash booker was the head of the White Panthers. The liner notes for this album are remarkable if you look them up. And I don't mean remarkable as in profound, just remarkable in terms of, I don't know if funny is the right way in that, but it's kind of like if you took the Unabomber Manifesto, because they're typed out. They even look like what it looked like. It's the Unabomber Manifesto mixed with like the language of the Weather Underground, or the sort of the '70s super left wing groups,
That
right?
sounds like a concerning thing.
With the Unabomber Manifesto, and then sort of some of the stuff you'd see in the very early Soviet era. I'm talking pre-Stalin Soviet era, repeating of ideas, very dry language. And it must say, like, we are the revolution. You cannot be unchained from the revolution. The MC5, it's very repetitive. So if you get a chance, look it up. In context now, it's kind of humorous. I'm sure there it scared all of the right people, including the largest department store in Detroit, who would not stock the record
Yeah, there's a
because
shock.
of that, but also because of, as Matt mentioned, the controversy behind the original version having them say, kick out the jams, motherfuckers. It was changed to kick out the jams, brothers and sisters, which you can imagine how well the band enjoyed that change.
But it was interesting because it wasn't on at all. There was no kick out. They just went into the song and on Spotify.
Yes, it's and eventually,
which I found
in later
interesting. I'm like,
presses.
why is Spotify holding back?
I don't know. There were multiple different versions of the album released for obvious reasons, depending on where you were releasing it. So,
yeah,
it wasn't until a year later that Jefferson Airplane, I think, broke the being able to say the word "fuck" on an album.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep.
That's interesting.
So that came later. To finish up my earlier thing, that the vocalist was Rob Tyner, who is very interesting in the sense that he has a very unique voice. He also does not look at all like what you would imagine a lead singer of the 60s and 70s would look like, because there were a couple archetypes that you imagine for lead singers in that era. We were getting right to the point when the longer hair, the golden god, so to speak, or, long hair just growing out was there. But also then you had sort of the mod fop top transitioning into long hair, but not shoulder length, right? Like a little bit above it. Rob Tyner does not have that. He's got shorter hair, and he's also stocky and small, both things that contrast with most of the people in the scene in that era who, if you look at a lot of the groups in that era, they ran thin, right? In terms of the members of the group.
He looks like he's got a fro.
And yes, he has a at times a short hair, and then at times like basically the equivalent of like a white man afro for lack of, I don't even know what to call it, white fro or something along those lines, but it's definitely, you'd have to call it that. The bassist is Michael Davis and the drummer is Dennis Thompson. So real short, couple interesting things that are always brought up about the MC5 besides what we talked about. They were written about in Rolling Stone before they ever released an album. The only other band, Matt, that I'm aware of that has that, do you remember the two I might be thinking of? Trivia question.
The Strokes.
The Strokes, yep. That's how I was thinking of. The Strokes were written about in Rolling Stone before their debut album. But I'm sure there might be somebody else, but that's the only one I can think of who has that going for them, along with the MC5. They're from Detroit, so MC5 is Motor City 5. They were actually pretty well known as the forefront of the Detroit music scene, and actually mentored the Stooges, and actually were responsible for the Stooges being signed, because the record company Elektra Records came out to sign the MC5, and then Wayne Kramer of the MC5 said, hey, you should see this band called the Stooges too. And then they were like, yep, and they did, and they signed them as well. So they came out of that with two different groups. They were known for opening for different people. They kind of had the Van Halen rep that they'd before they ever released an album, right, they'd open and blow away established groups, even ones that knew what they were doing. And in this case, they opened up for Big Brother and the Holding Company and Cream, and were well known for basically leaving the crowd exhausted by the time the main groups went on. And it's funny because you think a group with Janet Joplin that had their own frantic energy, as we found out in episode 1, and then Cream with their maestro level musicianship, and also their mercurial personalities. You can only imagine how well
Ginger Baker
and Ginger Baker, and to a lesser extent Eric Clapton. You can just imagine how they reacted to being blown off the stage by this group of left-wing Americans. But they also were very influential to punk rock, as I mentioned before. But we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but you can't hear this album without hearing the White Stripes either, another Detroit band. In fact, I'd say the first song on this album, Jack White, it's a foundational song in terms of how Jack White would sound later, especially in early White Stripes albums. But yeah, so they're legendary in the Detroit area. They were highly influenced, and here's one that you can tell, Matt, and I don't know if you were able to see this when it played, and probably I'll start asking you questions about it after this, but they were highly influenced by, obviously, blues, R&B, and garage rock, but free jazz, especially how John Coltrane sounded.
Yeah.
They tried to make their guitars sound like his saxophones in his group. And then also Sun Ra, which you can definitely tell on the last song, which I think they even gave a co-writing credit to Sun Ra on the last song, and they should, because it sounds exactly like a Sun Ra song, but that's Starship, the last one.
Yes. He does have a writing credit.
Yep, and then there's one cover on this, Motor City Burning. It's a John Lee Hooker song. So, you definitely hear a Sun Ra song on here. You definitely hear a couple songs that are garage rocky. There's a blues cover, so they're going all over the place. And I can definitely hear the sound of the guitars trying to sound like saxophones. You hear feedback on this album, which is very rare at this time. And at times it even sounds like not prolonged, but it sounds like the type of noise rock that you might recognize in, say, like a Yo La Tengo way. Not quite not so much, My Bloody Valentine, Sonic Youth, noise feedback, more like Yo La Tengo. And I know we're going deep in the weeds right there, but just in case you're familiar with any of those groups. So, yeah, I'll kind of end there. I think everybody also knows that they performed under the influence of LSD and pot pretty much every time they were on stage and recorded. And obviously that's a huge part of what they attributed their frantic energy, which you absolutely can hear. And this is a live album. It was recorded October 30th and 31st of 1968 in Detroit. So enough about the bio. What do you think, Matt? What do you think? I guess probably first question, how familiar were you with the MC5?
Pretty much in name only.
Okay.
They had popped up in recent years on documentaries, other artists mentioning them. We might have talked about them at some point. For some reason, it popped up in my head. I'm like, I was questioning whether they performed at Woodstock or not, but
they did not perform notoriously at the 1968 Democratic Convention, which is a story in its own right. A bunch of artists were supposed to show up, and none of them besides Neil Young did. Now, Neil Young showed up but did not perform, so they performed for 8 hours straight at the 1968 Democratic Convention.
Is that why there was such a riot? Is that why all the
I think that they were. It was a place where you would imagine the MC5 to be, but I do not believe they were the reason for the riots. I think that was more Abby Hoffman and some of the other people.
I'm surprised they weren't going for the Bernie Sanders candidate of that. Whatever.
I think that I think that the MC5 and the eventual shoot-offs of what the White Panthers became and stuff, and the Weather Underground and those type of left-wing groups, I think they make Bernie Sanders look like a moderate Republican in terms of some of their beliefs. Yeah.
So yeah, I didn't really know much about them. I think I knew Kick Out the Jams. I had heard that before. So not a whole lot. So I was interested in listening to it. Yes, I think you used the word frantic many times, and I would absolutely, echo that. Raw is another term that comes up, just full of energy, passion. These dudes are they're kicking ass, right? It's loud, it's aggressive, and it's not pulling any stops at all. So it's certainly like that. And you can absolutely hear the influence on punk, garage rock, type of genre. It doesn't, obviously the White Stripes, bands like that, very influenced.
Well, Ramblin' Rose, I mean, you can't hear Ramblin' Rose, the first track, without thinking
it sounds like White.
It sounds like a White Stripes song.
Frantic, voice, exactly. So, I struggled listening to this album.
Doesn't surprise me.
It's a bit much for me. So at the beginning, he's asking, "Are you going to be part of the problem? Are you going to be the problem or the solution?" And I'm just like, man, if I have to buy in this wholeheartedly, I might be the problem. So it's too much. It's I think some of the songs, I think it starts off okay. I do like the Ramblin' Rose and Kick Out the Jams. I struggle to find overall in the album any sense of any type of melody, really. And I don't need a whole lot of melody in songs, and certainly in punk, I think you can get away with, being more raw and just more in your face. But I still have to hold on to something. And I just felt like particularly the middle of the album was just too much. I think especially Rocket Reducer number 62 Talk, whatever the hell that means. It's just going way too much. And part of the song, I felt like I was listening to Bill and Ted from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, trying to figure out how to play their instruments. Not saying that they don't, but they're not playing. They're not tight at all. They're not playing together. They're kind of each different members are doing different things. And I think maybe if I was seeing this live, I'd get more into it. I would want to be towards the back though, because I think I would get killed in the mosh pit. But
I don't know if there were mosh pits during this era. You know what I mean? I think they were basically creating the frantic energy that would eventually lead to mosh pits.
Yeah, I mean I'm picturing this just being an insane live show and people just ramming into each other and going absolutely nuts. So Yeah, so and oddly, my favorite song on this is the cover is "Motor City is Burning." This
Mm-hmm.
was a little bit of a breath of fresh air because it's just a slow down. It's I believe it's the sixth song of on
Yep.
the album. There's 8 tracks.
Yep.
It's the sixth one. So you're just getting kicked in the face for the first 5 songs, and then this just brings it down to a slow blues groove that was way more palatable for me. And I thought the next song too, "I Want You Right Now," was softer, had a little bit more direction, a little bit more organization to the song, if you will. So, and then it ended with "Star Sailor," which all that stuff at the end, I'm like, are they trying to get me to just stop the listening? Because it's just too much. So this to me just felt very overdone. And I know that and so I'm gonna approach this from respecting it from a historical perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
and being very thankful that this is out there because it did influence a lot of artists that I do like now. But I can't ever see myself going back to this album. It's
Mm-hmm.
just yeah, it's too much, man. I got to hang my hat on something, and this is just all over the place for me.
Yeah, the Stooges cleaned up this sound a little bit, and they were pretty close to direct contemporaries. And if you listen to a Stooges album like Funhouse, for example, you'll be able to see, I think, what Matt was hoping for, a little bit more tunefulness in the album itself, which is probably why the Stooges albums check in the top 100, and the MC5 are outside of it. I enjoy this album quite a bit. I actually think their next album is a little bit better, but this album as a piece of history, as a guy who loves punk music, this is, Matt said before, people going in different directions. You're not even sure if they know how to play their instruments. I can vouch for the fact that the guitarists in this band know how to play their instruments. It's by design, as opposed to a band like, say, the Sex Pistols, where you're not 100% sure, how well but they were highly influenced by the MC5.
Well, and there are
Yeah.
parts in here
Mm-hmm.
where the guy, whoever the guitarist is, there's some cool parts where he's soloing, and it's like, geez, this guy is shredding it.
Well,
So
Wayne Kramer and Fred Sonic Smith are oftentimes playing, I'm pretty sure at times, the same note, just in different ways. So they're both well-regarded guitarists.
Yeah, there was just parts of that one song I was like, ugh,
Mm-hmm.
like it was just
Yeah.
it was too much.
No, and I would agree. The middle, especially that Rocket Reducer number 62 and Borderline. I don't love Motor City is Burning either. So that was, I found the listen to get more challenging at that part. I do like I Want You Right Now. Starship, as you said, do I think that needed to be on the album? I know they love Sun Ra, so. And I know they're also going across genres, so I know why it's there, but do I need it? No.
Yeah.
I would say, though, that the first 3, Ramblin' Rose, Kick Out the Jams, and Come Together, are all fantastic songs. And if you like aggressive rock music, whether it be leaning more toward metal or punk, or somewhere in that.
Hardcore even, it's just like
absolutely. Yeah. It's noise rock, all those. You're going to like this album more than if you'd go into music looking for an underlying tunefulness. You have to, I think a lot of people who like hardcore, punk, noise rock, to an extent, certain types of metal, not all, but certain types of metal, can deal with sort of the feeling from the music as much as the craft at times, the emotion, the visceral emotion. And that's what this MC5 album is. It's a visceral album. And
I wanted to like it,
mm-hmm.
I wanted to,
but you got to be honest.
Yeah, no. And I'm sitting, and I really gave it a good, honest, several listens. And I always thought when I first started listening to the first couple songs, because I do like, I'm like, yeah, the opening tracks are pretty good. There's some, there's some structure there. There's some melody that you can pick out. And the more I heard it, the more I liked it. And then, yeah, I wasn't a big fan of Come Together. And by the time I got to Rocket Reducer, I was just, no, it's like, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
So, but, props to them. In 1968, 69, this is certainly groundbreaking stuff.
You would probably like Back in the USA quite a bit. If I remember, yes, and I do know this. John Landau, the guy behind Bruce Springsteen, was actually the producer of that album. So it definitely, I think, would be more for your palate and might refine some of the stuff you like. As you might imagine, the MC5 folks hated that album after they released it. But it's considered to be the stronger album. And I would say as a blind listen, it's going to be an album that I think our listenership for the most part would probably enjoy more if you're unfamiliar with the MC5.
But you chose this one because of the historical.
I also chose it because it's in the 60s and back in the USA is in 1970. So yes, that would be
point.
Yeah.
Yes, my math was a bit off there.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was the main reason I chose it.
That was the main reason.
But I did choose the MC5 because I have listened to them since I was a teenager and have always appreciated their sound and just the rawness. And there's not a lot that sounds like them. And whether it be the Stooges or, 70s punk, especially bands like the Sex Pistols, to a lesser extent, the Clash. I know the Ramones were big fans. My Bloody Valentine, bands like that were fans of them in the noise rock era. And certainly the Detroit scene, the Redux scene that came back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but especially the White Stripes. I mean, Jack White's done his homework on these albums because at times,
Did you like this right away? Like you said, you listened to it in high school. Was this an easy get for you, or did you have to?
So I didn't necessarily listen to Kick Out the Jams, the album. I was listening more to a compilation of their songs, so it was around it. So I did enjoy that compilation. Did I enjoy it as much as I enjoyed later punk music or even the Stooges? No, not as much. But it's kind of like if you like that punk music that's poppy, you can listen to the Ramones, but you might find yourself liking what, say, Green Day or Blink-182, that punk. They took that pop punkiness and made it a little bit more complex than what the Ramones did, but it's impossible if you like that type of pop punk to not be able to go back to a Ramones album and to some degree appreciate what the Ramones were doing.
Well, no, that's where they get me, because that's catchy, that's melodic, that's structure, and like I said, I don't think because I like harder, music that's, more visceral, but I also think I don't need a ton of the melody, but I got to have something. I just found it lacking here for the most part.
Well, they weren't looking to make melody. Like I said, the jazz they liked was considered disruptive jazz. Sun Ra was notoriously freeform, and they liked garage rock, but they wanted it to be visceral, not as clean as, well, we'll talk about the Animals next week. But for example, there's a perfect example of a very clean garage rock band.
Yeah, I was not their target audience.
No, I don't think you were, but
not just because I wasn't alive.
Yes. So yeah, I would probably say that this one's going to be a tough one for most. Even I would say that I'm in the middle on this album. But if you are a punk rock fan, a noise rock fan, a metal fan, I definitely think you are more the target audience that they're looking for, and the chances of you enjoying this are fairly strong. But it is a very different album than the first album we talked about. In many ways, they represent two different archetypes of what music was trying to be in the 60s. So to pair them together was an interesting choice by us.
Yeah, there's very little similarities here at all, except maybe that they were the 60s. But
give them a listen, because we'll love the feedback both ways.
Do you know where they fell in the ranking in the 60s, John?
I do not have it up for me right now, but I will add it to cleaning the stats.
Well, I have it.
Oh, you have it? Okay, gotcha.
I do. They were close, 112 in the 60s.
Okay.
So they almost made it. They were close.
Gotcha. Well, they weren't well regarded by critics at the time, but a lot of critics have retroactively enjoyed them. Yeah. So there you go. So I think we're ready about the part where we like to tie it off. So I think we might call it an episode right now. I will say that we're going to tape one more episode that will exist as bonus content at some point in the future, whether it be next week, whether it be somewhere down the line. We will be unveiling it when you least expect it. So we will not unveil the two albums that Matt and I are going to cover, but we're going to do another double play. We're cleaning the attic, as you will, that will go into escrow for whenever we want to bring that out. So,
good word.
Yeah, there you go. I sometimes I can dig one out. It's one of my $5 words. So, and then as a reminder, this coming Wednesday, we will be posting this episode. So as you're listening to this is the Wednesday episode. So, and then the Wednesday after that, which would be the 29th, that's when we return to doing 3 albums. So as a reminder, again, Josh is going to be doing Scott 4 by Scott Walker. Matt is going to be doing Nashville Skyline by Bob Dylan. And I will be doing Santana by Santana. So you've got plenty of time to listen if you want to listen along with us. Anything you want to add, Matt, before we call this one a day?
No, I don't think so. It was interesting that we just happened to spend the entire time here in Detroit.
Yeah, that's not by design. Yeah,
no, that just happened. So, I hear a lot of music came out of Detroit back in the '60s.
Just a fair amount of representative music. Yeah.
You think it was more than Cleveland?
I think so. Yeah.
So maybe the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame should have been there.
Having spent some time at school out there, I know that it's a sore sense of which Midwestern city they picked for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
A lot of people wanted it to be in Detroit, but that's a conversation for another time.